The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is Faith, Survival, and Grace in America.
Good evening, everyone, and happy Thanksgiving. This is a special day in America. This day was inaugurated many decades ago, commemorating the gratitude that was expressed throughout history for this country, for the blessings of this continent that are experienced by this unique nation comprised of 50 states that have formed a union under a federal government. A state at the time when this nation was created was equivalent to a nation. So this is like a United Nations on this continent. And from around the world, people have come to this country to participate in this unique project and experience. We also acknowledge that there were those here before those who formed the nation that were indigenous to this continent, and that in many cases, these people were abused, murdered in wars that were ongoing, as has taken place over much of United States history. Others were brought here in bondage, in slave ships, and there's a stain on the history of this nation. And a civil war was fought in 1863 to abolish the institution of slavery, in which more people died than any other war in American history. And over 500,000, mostly white men, gave their lives and shed their blood in this war to end slavery. So certainly there has been trouble and turmoil along the way. But on this day, we express gratitude to our Creator for one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And so we wanted to do a special show on this special day. And we found the right person to have as a guest on this show. His name is Daniel Gray. And Daniel Gray was at the center of a recent controversy, a recent event that captured the attention of the nation, a nation that was already divided. And this event further divided the nation. And in fact, the day on which this event took place immediately evokes the whole situation and the whole divide. And you'll know what it is when I use the day January 6th. January 6th has gone down in history. Yes, that January 6th. And we have a gentleman, Daniel Gray, in the studio who was at the center of that controversy, who himself didn't really understand the forces at play. And we'll talk to him and get his perspective on it. But he was at the vortex of this divided nation and at the center of a controversy that resulted in a legal battle that went on. So I'm grateful to Daniel for joining us today, because the purpose of this show is not to divide or to take sides, but rather to unite, to allow people on all different sides of all different topics to present their viewpoints. Daniel has a unique viewpoint on the events that he was involved in. The title of the show that was just aired was one title. Another one that we talked about was Accountability, Grace, and Redemption on a Personal Level. So let's invite Daniel Gray to the studio, and let's start learning about his role in these events. So welcome, Daniel. I know we had some technical difficulties. Are you able to hear me okay?
I can hear you. I found the speakerphone button, so I can hear you just fine, yes.
Well, I was wondering, am I making this intro too long? But I actually wanted to do a little bit of a longer intro to give you the time to maybe resolve that. And I'm thankful, maybe there's some prayers involved and some thanksgiving to even correct the technical difficulties. So Daniel, before we get into the events of January 6th. As we always do on this show, we like to know who you were before all that. So I want to go back and talk about your creation story. Who were your parents? Where were you born? What were the early years of Danny Gray like? What were the forces that shaped you that maybe, contributed to some of the challenges that you then later had?
So I was originally born in Blackpool, England. My mother is British. My father is from Texas. They met in Germany. They were part of a very big church life. I was raised in Birmingham until I was about 7 years old. And we moved to America because I had a sister with special needs. And my parents believed that the healthcare standard in America was better than it was in England. And so we moved from Birmingham, England to Irving, Texas when I was 8.
Well, that's already a lot right there. I want to press the pause button because I didn't know this about you. So what church, because I spent 10 years in Germany and I was a minister while I was there, doing tons of stuff all over Europe and Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. So now I'm curious, what church movement were they involved in Germany? Do you know?
I was part of a church. It was called Restream Ministries. And it's big in It was big in Taiwan. It was big in, I believe, Japan as well. It was formed by a gentleman named Watchman Nee, and he spent a lot of time in incarceration. And in doing so, his faith really grew. He's kind of he's a testament to somebody whose faith survived in really hard places. And the church it was built around home meetings. It was very, very Christian. It was very traditionalist Christian. And so I was with that church for, my parents were with that church for probably about 10 years until we came to the States. And then my sister passed away when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and my family separated. I moved with my father. We did a lot of traveling around. He was a software engineer, and so we would do contracts. And so I lived in Texas, then I lived in Atlanta, then I lived in Florida. For a brief period of time, I actually moved over to Taiwan. I lived in Taiwan for 3 years when I was doing martial arts. Came back to America. I've lived in Vegas, Austin, a few other places. I've done a lot of traveling.
And Irving, Texas, just curious, is that near Dallas? I know I've been to Irving, but I'm trying to remember where it is now.
It's maybe a good 20 minutes outside of Dallas. It's where the Cowboys used to play. So.
Okay. All right. Okay. So then, so you're traveling around, living in these different places, and then you began to get into a little bit of trouble. Tell us about how that happened.
So I was. I was in a situation where I had a single parent home and I didn't have a whole lot of guidelines or restrictions on me. And so I never passed 7th grade. I actually dropped out in 9th grade, but I never actually passed the 7th grade. I skipped a lot of school. I was just kind of a hang around kid, spent a lot of time at malls and so forth. I never really had a whole lot of run-ins with the police, though. I never had a criminal record until the events of January 6th. But I would definitely say that I was a very rebellious kid. I kind of did a lot of self-raising. And I had a lot of bitterness and anger from, some situations in my past. And so I was a happy-go-lucky, but also a very resentful kid growing up.
And how did you support yourself then, from the time you started like dropping out of school, and you were still living at home? What did you get jobs? What did you do, sort of practically speaking?
Well, I didn't have I had a fairly affluent childhood. My parents both worked. My dad was fairly successful, so I didn't really have a street story. I had a good enough home. I never wanted for too much. I was just very rebellious when it came to things like education and structure and so forth. But I guess my childhood is a bit of a mixed bag because it was very well traveled. I had very, very successful parents, very successful grandparents, but we had some situations that divided our family, and that brought around its own set of problems.
Yeah, well, at some point then you began to get into drugs, I believe. And so what were you doing as you were sort of coming of age? Did you still live at home? What was going on there?
The stuff with the drug issues I had, they actually came later in life. It's funny, I was actually straight edge until I was about 18 or 19 years old. Wow. I didn't really drink. Yeah, I didn't really drink. I didn't really party. I started working in nightclubs about 21. My dad sent me back to England. I did 2 years of education in England. Then I came back to the States, and I kind of just floundered after that. I had good opportunities to go back to England, and I decided that I wanted to stay in America. I took a job as a bouncer at a nightclub, started bartending, and I bartended pretty much, all the way up until I was about 30 years old. At 26, I got into martial arts. I started training and competing. At one point, I was a professional mixed martial arts competitor. So I was fairly in control of myself up until like I'd say my mid 30s is really when things got bad.
And are you, are you a pretty big guy? And this will play in later. We've not met in person. How tall are you?
I'm about 5'9" on the best day.
Okay, so you're not that tall, but sort of what, obviously getting into the martial arts, you had a little bit of a street presence, maybe if needed.
Yeah. Well, we worked in the bars a lot, and I worked as a bouncer for years. Actually did get stabbed one night at work. I've seen shootings happen, and I worked in a very tough sort of environment, and that definitely did kind of shape my perspective on the world too. I think I got into martial arts because I came from, kind of like the childhood that I had, where I don't think I felt like I was a very tough kid. And then I started working in the bars, and then I was like, let me progress into something that's a little bit more wholesome. And I got into martial arts around like 25, 26. I met some good mentors and some good people. And, for a while, up until about my mid 30s, I really feel like I had it together,
So what happened in your mid 30s? What started to change mentally in your perspective that you began to look in other places and look at different ideas and so on?
So I moved to Taiwan when I was 30, and I moved to Taiwan. It was a big thing for me as a martial artist. I started teaching over there, and I worked for a company called Tough MMA. I believe it's called Shenmue now, if it's still around. And I had the chance to fight. I was really deep into the culture there too. It was a really good experience. And I had a marriage at the time that it became strained. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I wanted to travel. And I was married to a very lovely, very Midwestern girl who kind of wanted a simple life. When we came back to the States, I worked for about 3 years. I was incredibly unhappy. I think getting away from Taiwan really kind of made me feel like I was missing something in life. And it was on me. I got a big head. I got a big idea of what I wanted in life. I took a bigger job in a bigger city, started hanging out with people who were successful. And, some people, they might have had a music career or something like that. And, that kind of took me over. And I had a really bad knee injury. In jiu-jitsu, I had a guy just completely tear my knee out. And so I stopped training. And when I stopped training, I started drinking. I was using drugs. I started partying with the wrong people. I think that I really strained my marriage by doing that. And by kind of turning my eyes towards very selfish things. I want to be successful. I want to be around cool people. And, that marriage fell apart, and it was very, very hard. It was a very tough divorce. And what happened with me was when it was over, I literally got in my car and I drove all the way to Las Vegas, and I moved into a 300 square foot apartment by myself. I got away from everybody. And that's when it got bad, because I was by myself. I was in Las Vegas, and I started hanging out with people who worked on the strip, and doing things you shouldn't do, things I knew I shouldn't do. And eventually I ended up overdosing on fentanyl. And I was walking down the strip, and I remember it vividly. I was looking at one of these big bright Las Vegas signs, and the world just span out of control, and I screamed I need help. I fell to the ground. I woke up in an ambulance. And that was just kind of the beginning, honestly.
So I'm getting this picture now, and on the one hand, you were ambitious, you wanted to be successful,
Yeah.
but you had discipline, especially when it came to martial arts. You also had I don't know, courage, independence. You were able to like travel around the world, even in Taiwan, and be somewhat successful there. But I'm also getting the opinion of you're now past 30, and you're looking at your situation, and maybe you're not seeing a direct path to realize the success that you wanted, the sort of ambition side of you, but the particular skills or the particular area of professional life wasn't going to lead you or take you there. And now you're getting in with some other people that are maybe creating a mirage or a fantasy of what success might look like for you, and the gap between reality and where you're at is becoming stressful. I mean, am I sort of on at all track here with what's going on?
I think so. I've looked back on it a lot, and I've committed my mind to understanding my thought processes, and that's the conclusion I've come to. Is I think I became very vain, and I think I became very self-absorbed. I think that really affected the person I was with, and the end result of it was me just saying I'm going to go do something completely reckless in Las Vegas. And I lied to myself. They have the best martial arts gyms. You can further your career as a bartender. And that's not what happened.
Yeah. Okay. So then what happened next? So you had this fentanyl related overdose. You came out of that. Now what?
So I didn't stop. I stayed doing the same things because I wanted to work on. I was working for a nightclub on the Las Vegas Strip, and I wanted to work through 2020 New Year's. And so that was my goal. I was going to work through 2020 New Year's. And after that, I did actually say, okay, it's time for me to straighten up. And I got a job. I was selling timeshare, and it was a really cool experience. I met some really great people, and it pushed me to start working a little bit harder.
Which company were you selling timeshares for?
I don't know if they want me to say, but I was with Wyndham for a little while. Yeah.
Okay.
It was
we're Wyndham owners. So anyway, go ahead.
What do you know? I mean, I actually am a huge fan of time.
Your condolences, right? But anyway, go ahead.
So I was working for Wyndham, and all of a sudden COVID happened, and I don't really follow the news, so COVID kind of caught me off guard. And all of a sudden, like the entirety of Las Vegas just shuts down, and I don't have any money, and I'm still in the same place. And so I move into my dad's house, and I have just developed an incredibly bad drinking problem. I mean, everybody.
Where was your dad living now?
He was in Lago Vista, which is about an hour outside of Austin, Texas.
Okay.
And
back in Texas now, and yeah.
Yeah, I got back to Texas, and my dad was gracious enough to give me a place to stay, but I did everything I could to mess that up too. And I was just putting a lot of alcohol down, and eventually it got to the point where he had to ask me to leave his house. And so he asked me to leave his house, and I don't think that was a bad decision on his part. And so I took a job back in Atlanta, Georgia, with the company I worked at previously. And I worked in the gym business. I was doing sales and stuff like that. And I went to Atlanta, and I was sleeping on the floor of my friend's house. And it was during COVID, so we were still locked down. And that's really when I got into the stuff we talked about earlier with the doom scrolling. And I had this feeling like something just wasn't right, and I started reading these conspiracies about COVID, and it got to a place where I was, digging into, like, I don't know if you heard about the QAnon stuff as well. But,
I did. I never really researched into all that, but I'm very familiar with, the things that have said about COVID. I, in fact, during that phase had a really difficult time because I was getting my information from non-standard sources, and I had a completely different view of what was going on. And I tried to share some of that. I had a role that was contributing to making certain decisions for some community.
Okay.
And I was accused of, being a spreader of lies and misinformation, which really shocked me. And there was a formal letter written up and sent. I won't go into details, but so yeah, there was, this is where things really began to get divided in our country. I mean, the culture wars were already going on for decades, but it started to get real serious during the COVID era. Anyway, go ahead.
No, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, things became very divisive. There was a lot of mistrust. There was just a ton of misinformation on each side, and there was a lot of, it became a very divisive issue. And I dug my heels in. I'm like, there's a conspiracy going on here. There's something very wrong. I got into this whole world of, like, there's a shadow government, and this is an elite evil that's coming to get you. And you got to remember, I was stuck in an apartment, sleeping on the floor with just the internet connection during COVID, and there was nowhere to go. And I was in a very brokenhearted place, and I just dove into this stuff. And that sort of pivoted into the 2020 election, because COVID and the 2020 election were they sort of piggybacked on each other. And that's when it came up that, that this election is going to be stolen, and, you're all going to end up in concentration camps and everything else. And all this wild stuff came out. And I was just like, oh my goodness, yes, this is absolutely happening. And I fully believe it. And you got to remember, I was living in Atlanta at the time. And I used to live in Fulton County at one point. And just to explain the scenario, I'm staying at my friend's house, and like 15 mail-in ballots show up. And, I'm watching the president, and he's like, they're going to steal this election and everything else. And I really dug into it, and I believed it for whatever it was. And it got to the point where, I started getting censored on social media too. That was a new thing, because there was no censorship. They really didn't tag your post with misinformation before the 2020 election. Right. And all of a sudden I'm getting censored. And so it's actually pushing me to believe that I'm onto the right path. Like, all these like, this is misinformation. We're going into your DMs and everything else, and you can't post this post. I'm like, well, I must be onto something here. And it really became a feeling of like, there's something going on, and at some point I need to figure out what I need to do about it.
Yep. And perhaps also that sort of that ego-driven desire to succeed and make something out of yourself. Now here's something where you're privy to information that most people don't have or don't understand or don't see, and that sort of gives you a role to play that's maybe a little bit larger than life. Is that fair?
I would absolutely say that's fair. I think I took it on as an identity. I thought I was on a righteous path, and that I work at a very liberal gym in Atlanta, and I'm like showing people the stuff that I'm reading, and they're just looking at me like I'm crazy, because maybe I was crazy, at the time. But I was like, how come you can't see what I'm seeing? That this is dire. The whole world is going to come unraveling if we don't do something. And people are just kind of like shrugging me off. But what I don't realize is that I'm allowing myself to just to stop listening to anybody who doesn't agree with me. Forgive me, because if you don't agree with me, then you don't know the truth. Is my mindset, and I'm more and more convincing myself that I'm aligning with a righteous quest. If that makes sense.
Right. And that's where this divide happens, and then the echo chambers form, and it becomes a self-referential. You're like living inside an onion, and you keep adding layers on the onion. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to bring this first segment to a conclusion here, and then move on. So bottom line, you begin to get involved in or aware of that there's this, elections being stolen. And then there's going to be a demonstration about this topic. Generally speaking, the president's involved. He's giving a speech, and a lot of people are engaging in this whole scenario or situation with differing degrees of zeal, differing levels of information, different groups. And then there are some organizers like the Proud Boys. Were you ever part of the Proud Boys, or were you?
I've never been part of the Proud Boys. I get associated with them a lot. I was in prison with a couple of the Proud Boys, but I've never been a part of the Proud Boys.
Right. So you end up on the Capitol January 6th, and you end up indicted. You end up being charged. You end up in jail, because we're going to go now to this video, which is going to sort of take us from that moment. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the actual events of your trip to the Capitol on January 6th, what unfolded and what came next. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Daniel Gray and the topic accountability, grace, and redemption here on Thanksgiving on Created in the Image of God.
The story began inside a prison cell, a silent room, a notebook, a man trying to understand the wreckage of his own life. He wrote everything by hand, every moment that broke him, every memory that refused to stay buried, every step that pushed him towards something different. The pages follow the weight of consequence, the pressure of truth, and the unexpected guidance that appeared in the middle of that darkness. Not miracles, just people, conversations, and decisions that slowly reshaped the direction of a damaged life. A raw account of collapse, survival, and slow reconstruction. A journey carved in ink, built line by line, inside a room meant to break him. The Men from the Medium, by Daniel Gray. To learn more, visit Daniel Gray's Facebook page or scan the QR code for details.
Welcome back to Created in the Image of God, our special Thanksgiving show with Daniel Gray, the man who was just being referred to in that little video. And we'll get into the details of that. I just want to make a comment here about why have this on a show called Created in the Image of God? Well, part of the reason is that religions can be like that self-referential belief system, right? We've had, even within Christianity, we've had different churches condemn members of each other, members of the other church, to hell over tiny little doctrinal differences, right? And really believe that these other human beings are going to hell to be punished for eternity, because they believe in the Trinity or don't believe in the Trinity, or believe in the resurrection or don't believe in the resurrection, things that ultimately can't even be proven one way or another. And we're condemning people to hell because they don't believe what we believe, right? Now, Daniel, you were in your own kind of hell at this point, but you didn't yet realize it, right? So what led to you wanting to now go take active part in the events of January 6th, and walk us through that stuff?
So, I mean, I was kind of on my way anyways. I'd made the decision once the president had posted about January 6th that I was going. And so I walk into my boss's office and I literally ask him for 3 days off to go to January 6th. And that I anticipate coming back to work. And, we get into an argument back and forth and he's like, "You're not going." I'm like, "Well, then I don't have a job anymore. I'm going to this thing." That's how committed I was. And then when I walked out the office, I'd been banned from Facebook for like 30 days or something like that. And it was due to an infraction.
What got you banned specifically?
They said it was something from 30 days ago, but my conspiracy mind convinced me that I was being listened to at the time and that I needed to be deplatformed because I'm a very important person, obviously. And so that was kind of it. I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, I'm going now." So I went by myself. I hopped the flight and I did have friends that were going as well, but they were from a different place. And I flew in and the night before we went on a little walk around and checked the place out. And we got some food to eat, and there were a couple speeches, and we went to bed. And the next day we woke up at like 9 a.m., had some coffee, and we headed to the protest. And I guess I can just kind of keep going about the whole thing.
Yep.
But so we go to the protest, and honestly, like Trump was kind of talking a lot, and it was cold, it was so wet out there. I had Converse on, my feet were frozen, and I honestly believe this is the absurd thing. I honestly believe it was going to be some big show, like maybe Joe Biden being brought out in chains or something like that. It was just the absurdity of my mindset at the time was just, I really thought that this thing was going to crescendo that day. And I'm kind of waiting for our leader to sort of, make his move.
Because there were conspiracy theories about all the evil machinations on both sides. And it's like a war going on and they're going to do this and we're going to do this, but our side's going to win.
There's they have what they say in conspiracy world is they have the white hats and the black hats. And the white hats are the ones who work behind the scenes to do good. And the black hats are the ones who work behind the scenes to drive us towards a dystopian future. The truth
I noticed you're wearing a black hat. Is there any symbolism there?
I just have a bald head and I wear a hat. You're probably always going to see me with a hat on, But yeah, and so I'm kind of waiting there. The speech kind of goes on, and they're talking about a lot of the numbers and stuff, and this state had these numbers and this, that, and the other. And at some point, Trump's like, "I want you guys to march down and we're going to protest out in front of the Capitol." And, I was walking, we're singing like YMCA and like people were like dressed like Uncle Sam. And, at the time it really felt like a wholesome protest. There were like down Pennsylvania Avenue were just so many cars and so many people.
So dare I say at that moment, it was still a mostly peaceful protest, or was it peaceful?
So. I mean, I don't know what was going on at the Capitol before I arrived there. But I would say the vibe was that it was like, people were hugging and taking photos with each other and stuff like that. And you have to understand that almost everybody that went to January 6th did not behave the way I behaved.
Right.
A lot of them were people who just went there with the purest of intentions and they wanted to support something. And that was it. And a lot of them they were well-meaning people, And so I arrived at the Capitol probably around probably 2:10, something like that. And we're all kind of waiting outside, and the Capitol fills up, like the outside of it. It's like maybe 10,000 people, then it's like 30,000 people, then it's 150,000 people. And people are standing on the fountains and everything. And it was as quiet as mountains because everybody's waiting to hear the results, but nobody's phone is working because there's so many people, obviously, that there's no data. And so people are like winding up ham radios and everything. And we're all waiting, and you can hear a pin drop. And then all of a sudden out of the crowd, you hear a bunch of people, they all at the same time, they go, "Pence betrayed us, Pence betrayed us." And the crowd just pops. I've worked nightclubs and crowds before, and I've never seen a crowd like just move, like almost like an ocean of people, just like swaying side to side. And it was overwhelming. I got separated from the crowd that I was with. And so I'm almost at the very front of the protest. And I look at the very front of the protest and I see police and I see protesters, and they're squabbling, they're kind of pushing back and forth. And I literally think to myself, I'm going to walk up here and I'm going to take a photo of this. I'm going to post it on my social media. And so I walk up to the front of the protest. I take my camera out, and I'm literally like, this is how absurdly stupid I was. I'm literally face to face with an officer. I take my camera out like this, and one of the officers grabs my camera out of my hand, and they pepper spray me in the eye. And that was all it took. You know, I got too close to the protest. I shouldn't have been where I was. And I took that as like all the reason I needed to get involved. And I mean, I can, from then on, I go back to the front, I put my back to the police. I get pushed through the crowd. I end up on a stairwell. These police come down, I bury myself, they can walk over me, and I end up on the other side of them. And so I'm standing where they inaugurate the president, and I look in front of me, and the guy shoots tear gas at me, and it lands on my feet and just explodes. And you know, I'm choking on this tear gas, and I look to my left and I see a staircase, and so I run up the staircase, and I run through a tunnel, and I end up at the very front of the Capitol building, the West Terrace entrance. And this moment,
so at this moment, there's been a police barricade. You've sort of maneuvered yourself, and you know you've done martial arts. You've been a bouncer, so this is an environment you kind of feel somewhat familiar with, and you know, almost like what are these guys who do cross training where they're jumping from walls to staircases? To, you know how to move within this kind of a situation, and you end up on the other side. Have you now illegally trespassed? Is the police barricade?
I'm assuming that I'm guilty of something at this point.
Yeah. So within yourself, you assume you were guilty, but now in hindsight, had you perpetrated a punishable crime at this point?
There would be some type of a remaining in a restricted area. You could probably put a violent charge on. There are crimes committed at this point. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I just want to sort of frame this up for the audience, for myself, so we understand what's going on. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So I end up at the front door of the West Terrace entrance, and this video has like been one of the most controversial videos about January 6th because I'm at the very front of the crowd, and there's 3 or 4 police officers, and the crowd's yelling back and forth with them. I join in, and we're just going back and forth with the police. And I remember one of the officers actually kept saying, "I agree with you guys, but this is not the way." You know, but I'm all the way up right now. You know, this, that, and the other, and I'm just yelling, but I am yelling with the cops. I'm at the very front of the crowd, and what happens is
were you under the influence at all at this time, or?
No, I wasn't. I can't blame it on that. You know, this is just me doing it, and so I'm at the very front, and there's 3 officers. They're all Capitol Police officers, and then another officer walks up and he taps them all on the shoulder, and they all turn around and they walk inside. And the assumption was, okay, we're being led in the building. This is a very, very popular video in like January 6th conspiracy lore. And so they, you know, I followed them inside the building, and I kind of didn't know what I was doing. But it probably wasn't what I should have been doing, you know. And so I walk around inside the Capitol building, and I'm just kind of in there, you know. And somebody's like, they got people who have like a boom box in there, they're playing music. It smells like marijuana in there. And like people they're doing protest stuff. And I end up getting into another pushing match with the police. I'm putting my back to them. They're pepper spraying us and stuff, and I'm just being completely reckless. And
so this is part of, you know, controversial, yes, but also a little bit difficult to understand because you in your own mind have already committed crimes, trespass, but there were a whole bunch of people in there doing this at this point.
Yeah, you know, I guess that's kind of a testament to groupthink. You know, we're a crowd, we're united in this. We're all, you know, part of some sort of brotherhood at this moment and united for a cause. And so, yeah, that's definitely a part of it, you know.
Okay. Anyway, go ahead.
So I walk around and I see the officer that I thought stole my cell phone, right? It's a female officer, and she was the one who was standing in front of me when I get pepper sprayed. And so I walk over and I asked for my cell phone back like 5 or 6 times. Can I get my cell phone back? Can I get it back? And they ended up playing that video of me in front of Congress. And so anyways, I realized pretty quickly that I'm not getting my cell phone back. The officer gets into a fight with another lady in the crowd. The lady punches the officer first. The officer retaliates according to what she's allowed to do because the lady didn't punch her first. The crowd surges forward. I end up at the very front. There's another gentleman in between me and the officer. The officer swings a baton at my head. I put my hand up to block it. And then 14 seconds later, the officer falls down a flight of stairs. And I didn't even see that part happen, but it did happen. And then I turn around and I stay in for about 5 or 10 more minutes. And then one of the officers inside, he yells, it's a felony to be in here. And I'm like, oh, this is a felony. Okay, I need to get out of here. And so I turned around and walked out of the building. And I went back to my Airbnb, and social media was going crazy, and there was a lot of stuff going on. Everybody was kind of freaking out, and there's a lot of sub stories here. But the person who had my phone was stolen. My friends were calling it, and the person had answered it, and I ended up using another phone to call the number that the person had given, and they wanted me to meet them the next day, and I actually didn't do that. And that was the end of the saga of my cell phone. So that's the full day of January 6th.
So you might have gotten it back had you met with that person, is what you're thinking, or it was entrapment. If you had met with that person, you might have been taken into custody sooner.
I don't have a thought on that. That's just what happened. I mean,
okay.
I can trail a rabbit hole all day long around there, but I just don't have the facts,
Yep. Okay. So then fast forward now, videos begin to be reviewed, people begin to be identified, actions begin to be taken to find those people, capture those people. What next for you in terms of this path towards incarceration?
So I get back, and I know that I heard Nancy Pelosi said she was going to give 20 years to the people, or I heard something like that. And so I was like, oh, I probably need to go on the run. And this is what I did. I packed up my car, I drove to Florida. I moved in with somebody I knew for a little while. And then at some point I ended up with no place to stay. I was sleeping on couches and sleeping in my truck. I ended up sleeping at a job site. A friend of mine, a friend of mine's friend had a business, and they gave me a room to sleep in there. And April and May, they passed, and I kind of thought to myself, okay, I guess they're going after other people, sort of thing. And I get in my truck one day, I'm driving to the beach, and I see a bunch of police officers behind me, and I assume that the person behind me is getting pulled over. And then they move out of the way, and I'm like, okay, I guess I'm the one getting pulled over. And then all of a sudden it's like, I hear, driver, stop your car, get out of the vehicle. And so I put my hands out the window. And my assumption is this has nothing to do with me. I'm literally thinking I'm going to talk to these guys. I'll be at the beach in 30 minutes. I can't see them. I just know that there's a lot going on. I got my hands up, and I walk back towards the sound of their voice. I lay on the ground. They put my hands behind my back, they handcuff me, they sit me up. I look around and I see all these FBI vests, and I'm like, here we go. They got me, and that's the arrest story. They took me to Duval County Jail that night. The next day I was in the feds. Within 36 hours, the FBI, here's the thing, the FBI guys that took me to prison were actually really, really nice guys. They were cool guys. Like they didn't, it was nothing personal with them. They had a job, and a lot of them told me that. They were like, hey, look, I just got to take you have to go to prison. And I'm like, look, this is my fault. I get it. I know you're not, this is not a malicious action on your part. They actually brought me Burger King twice. And so
I got to ask sort of your mental state in these months between January 6th and this arrest. Clearly you had kind of moved on in a couple of different ways. So were you still involved at all in any groups, or was your experience coming so close to being, charged with a felony, or you backed off and maybe tried to get on a little bit of a better track, or what was going on there?
I don't think so. I think I was probably in the exact same mindset. I think,
okay.
I think I thought that, we went out there and we stood up to the government and all this stuff. And, there were a lot of people on the conservative side were like very supportive, so it created a weird mind for me to be in, because I had a lot, I know there's impending trouble coming. I know that it's, if the FBI's after you, they're going to get you at some point. You can only hide for so long. But then I have people that are like, they're very like, yeah, man, that's the American way, is to do things like that. And so I was kind of conflicted between two mindsets. And so I go to court, and I don't realize how much trouble I'm actually in. I know I've been arrested by the FBI. I know that I'm in a courtroom now, but I don't know what I'm actually facing. And so I get in court, and they read my charges out, and they tell me I'm facing 37 and a half years. And my first reaction is, honestly, I literally just laughed. I was like, this can't be serious, And then the absurdity of the federal court system is that they take me through all my charges. They tell me I'm facing 37 and a half years. They take my DNA. And then 6 hours later, I walk out of the building and I'm a free man again. So I'm like, I'm just kind of perplexed by the whole situation. I just got arrested at gunpoint by the FBI. I told them basically facing a life sentence, and now it's like come back next Friday and here's a bag of Burger King. You know, so yeah, that was a very surreal situation.
Wow. So then, what happened next?
So you end up in the legal process, and it's honestly a waiting game. And the blessing that I had a lot of blessings, but the first real blessing I had, outside of the friends who would help me out and stuff, was I had a fantastic public defender, and it's a lady named Maria. She's a DC public defender, and I don't know her politics, but I guarantee that they weren't like mine at the time. And she was the first person to really get involved in my case. And the first strategy that we were very strategic in how we approached the case. And the first thing we thought about was they have multiple other defendants that are facing these charges. And the number one charge we had was the 1512 obstruction charge. It's the one that went in front of the Supreme Court eventually. And so I had the 1512 obstruction charge. I had 8 other charges as well. There are a bunch of comparables. Let's play the waiting game. Let's let everybody else go first, and we'll kind of see what this looks like. Because this a lot of this was unprecedented. They really didn't have case law to make assumptions about what kind of sentencing we were going to get, or about even what charges would stick and which ones wouldn't. And so the practical decision was to sit it out. And so we just kept delaying and kept delaying and kept delaying. And that went on for almost 3 years. And the big hang up I had was I had an officer assault charge, which I was guilty of assault, but there was an injury enhancement. This is how the feds work. And the assault that I had was I definitely did grab the officer's baton when it came at me. But I maintain that I'm not guilty of this officer's fault because it happened 14 seconds later. It doesn't mean that I'm not responsible. It doesn't mean that I wasn't there or that my actions didn't in some way contribute to this. But the case I was making was this was not a malicious action. This was a mistake on my part. And the plea that the DOJ wanted me to sign, I would have to take full responsibility of that. And that was the only hang up. Honestly, I would have pled guilty probably within the first few months, because I was as close to homeless as you could possibly be. And I kind of looked at prison as like, okay, they got food, they got a place to stay, I can get back in shape again.
People were being nice to you.
Yeah, I was, and so we had a 3-year thing with the DOJ, and it went on, and eventually I had a different attorney take my case over, because they loved the fact that my cell phone had been taken. And then I was walked in the building too. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to file an entrapment claim, And so you'll read some of those articles about it, like Daniel Gray files an entrapment claim. But I had no idea that's what they were doing, honestly. Like I was a little bit starstruck because he's kind of a high profile attorney. And then they were, you're not wrong, you're right. We're gonna, you're not gonna face any time at all, just go with us. And so I went with them, and then one day I wake up.
You're actually the victim here, is what they were telling you.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course. You've been wronged here, and we're going to tear down the whole government system, and you're going to be the catalyst for it, and all this stuff. And yeah, so I had that attorney take my case over, and then the separation between me and that attorney and between me and my public defender was just miles apart. Like my public defender was so hands-on, so incredibly empathetic. She really wanted to see me get out of this thing. She saw that I'd made a lot of mistakes in life, that I had some problems, but at some point, I think she kind of realized that maybe I could have a future past this, and so she really, every phone call was answered, every email was answered. She would have 2-hour conversations with me about the case. And when I got my second attorney, he had so many cases that you just never see him. And then all of a sudden, now I'm claiming entrapment against the federal government in DC in a January 6th case. Like, there's no way this is a horrible strategy, and so that went on for probably about a year. But the problem is that when you're under indictment, time goes on, and you have to get a job, and you have to get a place, and you have to kind of move on with your life. And so, your federal case will seem like it's a million miles away sometimes, and you'll literally just think it's going to go away on its own. But that is not the case. You'll get a new prosecutor, they'll stretch this thing out again. It's never going away, and at some point you have to face it. And so I end up, once again, I'm homeless. I'm back in Jacksonville, and I guess I can kind of segue into this part of the story. I get a bartending job, and I meet this young lady, and her name's Corey. And we met, and she saw my situation, and she ended up moving me into her house. And she was not a conservative. She's African American, heavily tattooed, very liberal, LGBTQ plus. Like, she was the last person you would ever think that would want to date a guy like me. And on our second date, I told her, I was like, I'm one of the January 6th defendants, and she literally said, I was screaming at you on the TV that day. But for some reason, she decided that she was going to stand by my side. And so for 3 years while I was fighting this case, I was living with a very left-leaning woman who was my only real source of support.
And how did that play into this eventually getting resolved? I know the answer. This is a question for the audience, right? So you had a left-leaning judge eventually. You had a public defender who also wasn't necessarily on your side, ideologically, and you had now a girlfriend, I guess you were living with her, who also was kind of on the other side of the culture wars, if you will. And how did all this play into the eventual resolution of your situation?
So I faced the Honorable Judge Amy Berman Jackson. And if you Google her, you're going to see that her name is almost synonymous with Trump. Whenever Trump does something, she's generally a judge that rules against or has some sort of influence in that. And so, when I first got my judge assignment, I Googled her and I literally freaked out. I was like, she's the person who gave Roger Stone 10 years in prison. That was a big story. And so the first thing I see is gives Roger Stone 10 years in prison. I'm like, oh man, I'm done. This is completely over with. But I have to mention another friend too. I have a friend named Mike. Mike is a personal friend for 20 years. He's also a criminal defense attorney. He's also very much not in line with the person that I was back then. But he spent a lot of time with me. He spent a lot of time talking about my mindset. Because you have to remember, I'm literally being told by this is my fault, take accountability, but I'm allowing people to tell me you need to fight this thing. And you need to go in there and you need to tell the judge that this is a travesty and this is unfair and so on and so forth. And I honestly felt guilty. I was like, but I know that I shouldn't have done that. I know that I shouldn't have been involved in this. And, so he was really big about Daniel, I want you to sit down and think about what's going to happen to you if you do these things. If you go into a federal court in DC and you start, banging your fists around and saying these things, you're not going to see the light of day for 10 years. And he actually told me that. He told me that very bluntly while we were eating tacos one day. And it was one of the nicest things anybody's ever done for me, as far as I need you to pay attention to your life. And so there was that. And then I had Maria, who she more and more is the more we got into the case, the more we looked at the video evidence, she was like, you know what, Daniel, I do agree with you. I'm going to stand up for you on these things, and I'm going to make decisions that you want to make, because I know that this is important to you, And so she was big, but the big thing for me was, honestly, it was living with Corey, because I was in the most bizarre mindset, in a very angry, very upset, very self-righteous, very woe is me type of mindset, And I wouldn't say I hated the left, but I was so off put by the left. And I thought that every single person on the left was my absolute enemy, and that all they wanted from me was the absolute worst. I'm in all these media stories and so everything else, but this is a 3-year relationship, and there was a lot of tough times that I was going through that she was helping me with, And then I'm starting to see her world more, And at some point I would just ask her, why do you believe this, or why do you believe that? And about 2 years after about 2 years of that, I didn't care about January 6th anymore. I didn't care about the politics of it. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like an absolute idiot, and I felt like I put myself in a really, really bad situation. And I have to give her the grace for that, because it was really just her attentiveness to me and her spending time and her willing to just sit down and listen to me and then kind of give me some feedback. It really mirrored a lot of things to me. And at some point, it was so bizarre, because I was so done with it, and then I had to face it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So that was that transition that helped you, in terms of the title, accountability, grace, and redemption. Seeing grace in some of these other people who were ideologically on the other side of you on many of these issues, enabled you to more fully take accountability for what you had done, which was, perform illegal actions in a highly tense situation, visible in front of the whole country. Some of those people that were vilifying you as the most evil thing on the planet, their views were exaggerated, but yet you were there and you were representing the thing that they feared.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And one thing I had to wrestle with for a long time was, you know, for a long time I felt like, I wasn't guilty. I wasn't this, that, and the other. That, yeah, and what really happened was after I got out of prison, I had conversations with a lot of people, and they would tell me things like, January 6th was a very, very hurtful day for me. And at first I would really resist that. Like, what do you mean? How, but then, if the perception's real, it's real. If somebody feels a certain way about you, and if it's a lot of people, at some point you have to own that and say, okay, yeah, I guess my actions did deeply, offend a lot of people, and I'm gonna have to carry that for probably the rest of my life on some level. And so that was that.
So eventually, there was a plea bargain deal under discussion. There was a lenient sentence. There was a decision. Tell us about that.
So what happened was I ended up finding the Officer Fall video, and I found it on Twitter. And I found a bird's eye view of what happened with the Officer Fall video, because I only had like 4 or 5 like grainy body worn cameras, so it was very like hard to tell. And I ended up finding a video that did show the officer still standing about 5 seconds after they said I shoved the officer down the stairs. And so I presented it to my attorney. I went back. I fired my other attorney. I went back to my public defender. She was gracious enough to take me back. I'm never going to be ungrateful about that. That was huge. So, sorry. So I ended up they presented to the prosecution. The prosecution said, okay, this is a little bit different. And they reworded the plea. They reworded the plea to say that me and the crowd pushed the officer. And then we found the video of the actual fall. It was 14 seconds later. It was about 10 steps apart. And so at some point they had to concede, okay, Daniel grabbed the baton at this time, and then 14 seconds later, the fall did happen. So I signed the exact same plea agreement, right? With the exact same sentencing guidelines. Nothing was taken away. All I got was one sentence changed in that plea agreement. And that was my 3-year fight with the DOJ. Was I do feel like I'm guilty, but I want to have some integrity about how I plead guilty to this. I can't sign a blank plea. There's a little bit of nuance here, but I also need to accept responsibility. And a lot of it was my public defender. She went out there and she had a paralegal who put a 38 picture like whole workup in there. It was pretty determined. It used like our shoes as our positioning, and it was very intricate. And so we went to sentencing, and I signed a plea agreement that said that I was signing a 4.5-year plea agreement. But the prosecution had the right to ask for an enhancement based upon the proof of body harm. So they had the right to ask for a 6-year sentence, but we're asking for a 4.5-year sentence, and we're going to ask for leniency. And so we didn't know how this was going to play out. I didn't know what Amy Berman Jackson was going to do. I didn't know any of it. And so we went into court, hopeful for a light sentence, and prosecution went in court hoping for a 6-year sentence.
And
so
we're going to go to commercial break. When we come back, we're going to find out the answer to this. Don't go anywhere.
Your story has the power to start a movement. Journalism is more than a tool for broadcasting news. It's an important way of fostering meaningful cultural relationships that create tangible change in our society. With our anthology Cultural Journalism, you can now do your part and make your mark. From expert writers to passionate amateur, everyone has a story to tell. Our aim is to promote equality, empathy, and create a safe space for different perspectives and interpretations of the world around us. Come join us today and break free from the toxic news cycle. By submitting your story to Cultural Journalism at info@soupllc.com.
So I thought that would be an appropriate one, because imagine an anthology of 30 different people telling their story of what they saw on January 6th. And going from perspective to perspective and seeing all of them. But anyway, so now we're sitting on we're there waiting for what, the sentencing?
Yeah, so we're waiting for the sentencing. And so I had to put together a sentencing memorandum. And I had to make a decision about how do I want to approach this. And I looked at everything. I looked at my whole life, and I was like, you know what? These last 5 years have been an absolute disaster. And I want freedom from it. And so we started to make a case for leniency. And I put together a letter to the judge. It was like a 4-page letter. I went out and I found every single friend that I could think of. I said, will you write me a letter to the judge? And I got 40 letters. And I put together a 4-page sentencing memorandum. I went through everything. Your Honor, this is every mistake I've ever made in my entire life. These are all the problems I've had. This is where I see myself. These are the mistakes that I made on January 6th. And it was very important. I said, I deserve to go to prison. And these are the plans that I have when I get out. And that was big, but what really moved the judge was the woman who stood by my side at the time. She wrote a letter to the judge, and she wrote it from the perspective of, Your Honor, I am not a conservative. I'm not a Trump supporter. I'm none of these things, but I've been living with this man for 3 years. I know he's made some mistakes. He's a complete idiot, but he does deserve to come home at some point. And when we got to sentencing, the judge read through all the letters that we written. She paused on Corey's letter, and she spoke about it, and she commended our relationship. She commended my effort to transform. And so let me frame it this way. I go up to get sentenced, right? And I'm standing there, and the judge starts speaking, and I'm sweating, and I'm so nervous, and this is the big moment. And I look up, and she's actually yelling at me. You know, you've done this, and you've done this, and I'm just like, oh my goodness. And I'm just nodding, and I'm just in agreement, hoping this will end. And so at some point, I look down and there's sweat all over the podium. I'm like, oh my goodness. And then at some point she pivots like halfway through, and she starts like saying, and Daniel, your friends described you as being empathetic. And, you know, I commend you to try to overcome drugs and alcohol. And she goes, I commend your relationship with Corey, and, you know, I support that. And then she said, as far as the work of changing your life, I believe the work has already been done, Daniel. And then she told me, and now you also said that you need to go to prison. You're exactly right. And somewhere in that, there was a gavel hit. There were a couple of numbers read out, and I didn't know what happened. I didn't know what I was sentenced to. And I looked over at my attorney. I said, "What did I get?" She goes, "You got 30 months." I was like, "That's not bad, is it?" And she's like, "No, that's not bad." And I just give her a big hug. And you know, what had actually happened was the Honorable Judge Amy Berman Jackson had actually decided to believe in me. And this is, people have to understand. Just Google her and see what you think, how you think she would treat a January 6th defendant. And I'm just speaking for myself. I can't speak for any other defendant that went in front of her. This was my experience. I took accountability for my situation. I asked for mercy and asked for forgiveness, and I absolutely got it from one of the highest judges in America.
So 2.5 years. When was that sentencing?
The sentencing would have been sometime around December, I believe. October, I think it was. Yeah.
Of 20.
That would be 23 going into 24.
2023. Meanwhile, we're in an election cycle, right? So did you actually go to prison?
Yeah, so I was given the right to self-surrender. And the feds are very weird because their sentences can be very tough, but they're very lenient about how they take you to prison. They'll go home, get your stuff organized, pack a bag, and then go to prison in 2 months. And so I get home, and that is like the hardest and darkest period of my entire life because I'm on an ankle monitor now. I'm stuck in a house. I know I'm going to prison. I'm just so overwhelmed with just everything that's on social media. I'm back in the media again. And so I became a recluse. I stayed inside. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't do anything. And, you know, the woman who stood by my side, she threw me a goodbye party and, you know, everything else. And then one day I'm literally driving a car to a federal prison in Jessup, Georgia.
And do you remember what that day was?
April 4th, the day after my birthday.
April 4th, 2024?
2024, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So fast forward. So you go to prison. We don't, you know, sadly, this has been so wonderful and so fascinating. And I'm so curious. And I really appreciate you taking the time to personally share with me and the audience this journey. It's been just informative and heartwarming in a way. And so we're not going to have time to do much more today. I'm going to invite you back. I don't know if that's something you're willing to do, to come unpack this more fully. What I want to get to today is, so you entered prison on or around April 4th.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward, we have an election, and you were shown leniency by those against whom you were protesting. And now you're pardoned by those for whom you were protesting.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
What happened?
So I was watching the Trump inauguration inside of prison, and there was a lot of talk. I mean, obviously, when you're in prison and you're a January 6th defendant and the election's going on, you're going to get a lot of attention. And I'm watching this thing, and it doesn't seem like anything's going to happen. So I'm just like, I'm kind of resigned to being in prison. And then all of a sudden, I'm watching the TV, and then Trump comes on, and he's like, "To my January 6th defendants, you guys are going home tonight." And I'm like, "Tonight? How's that possible?" My case manager shows up. She walks me into the office, and she said, "Hey, Daniel, I have a letter from the administration. You've been pardoned by the president. You're going home." I just break down. I can't believe this thing, you know. And then there's some questions about who's getting pardoned and who's not getting pardoned, because remember, I had the officer assault charge, and so JD Vance a couple of weeks ago had said that the people with assault charges weren't getting pardoned. And so they tell me, "Okay, actually, Daniel, you're not getting pardoned," and they send me back to my bunk, and I'm like, "Okay." And I go sit in my bunk, and I'm just in there, and then all of a sudden somebody comes in with a flashlight, and he's like, "Are you Daniel Gray?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm Daniel Gray." And then he's like, "Pack your stuff, you're out of here." And within about 45 minutes, it was about midnight, you know, I'm outside of the prison riding with a friend of mine back to a friend's couch to sleep on.
So help us understand the nature of that technicality. Assault charge, not an assault charge. Did they pardon people who had assault charges, or you fell through the cracks? What happened?
Trump pardoned everybody but about 11 people. He did a blanket pardon for everybody in or around the Capitol the days before, the days after. And then
so it wasn't. So he specified which ones were not going to get pardoned or something like that.
It was basically the Proud Boys didn't get pardoned. The Proud Boys, they got a clemency, so they got released from prison, but they still have their charges. And so it was 11 of those, because they all faced seditious conspiracy charges.
Right.
So they had some of the highest charges ever leveled at an American citizen before, you know, from the government. And so those cases were put off pending further review. But I ended up receiving a full, complete, and unconditional pardon.
And yet all of this was transformative to you. So today you're not, so how do you look at all that? That's the redemption part, right? Or is the redemption part still ongoing?
I would say it's going to always be an ongoing process with me. I think we're always aspiring to do something better. You know, grace isn't earned, it's given, and it's something you receive. It's not something you earn. And you know, with regard to that situation, I have to accept it. You know, I was in prison with a lot of guys who would take that situation. And in fact, right before I walked out, somebody pulled me aside and said, "Don't forget how lucky you are to be getting pardoned, because any of us in here would give anything to be pardoned. Not just released from prison, but to have a full, complete pardon is
yeah." My sister was a felon, and it impacted her whole life.
Yeah.
And she was killed about a year ago. Well, it's not even a year ago. It's like only like 7 months ago, by a drunk driver. And she died a felon.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it dramatically impacted her quality of life in so many ways.
You know, and I have to be honest about being privileged, and you know, I've been in prison, I've been around prisoners, I've met people with stories that, you know, their situation was multiple times worse than my situation could have ever been. And they got years longer, and their families have left them, their kids have moved on, and nobody calls them. And, you know, they're never, you know, so I have a tremendous amount of empathy for anybody who's been through the criminal justice system. You know, it's a very, very difficult thing, especially on the people who are on the outside. It's not just, sometimes it's kind of easy to sit in prison because you just sit down all day, you know, but getting out of prison is actually harder than going to prison, because you got to get out and you got to rebuild your life again. Going to prison is kind of like, okay, I'll go to prison, you know. But when you get out, all of a sudden you have these expectations, and the world's not going to meet you there, especially if you have a criminal record. You're going to have, you know, multiple obstacles to overcome. You know, it leads to a lot of problems, I think, in the criminal justice system.
Well, and now I'm like sitting here reflecting on what I just said, and I have to clarify that the case with my sister we haven't even had the initial hearing, because to your point, it just keeps getting continued and continued and continued. Right?
Yeah.
And so what I said may not be accurate, and I have to retract it. There was a police report in which there was an accident. My sister died, and there was alcohol involved. I'll just say that, because I probably said something I shouldn't have. You probably know that more than most people on the planet, that you don't go talking about stuff when it's being settled. So wow, what a story. And so this book now, you were writing this, your story while you were in prison during those months. And
Yeah.
the title of the book is Men from the Median, or so. What's exactly the title?
Is the
And
title
what does that title indicate? Because I didn't quite get the symbology there.
So I was in a low security prison. I had a very, very easy time in prison. I was placed into a low security prison. I wasn't with a whole lot of violent offenders. If they were violent, they worked their way down. And at some point, what happened was they started bringing buses over with people from the media, right? And this happened sort of towards the end. And these were guys who've been in prison for like 20 and 25 years. And they were people who were put in prison because of the crime bill.
So
the drug
medium means medium security.
Medium security prison, correct. And so initially I was writing this book because the woman that stood by my side, she was a reader. And so I was kind of almost writing a love letter to her. I was writing I was framing her as somebody who was, very important because she was. And then I ended up in prison and I'm around these guys that have done like 15, 20, 25 years. And I start realizing I just have so much empathy for them because I could never imagine. And the writing shifts to where I start talking about what their experiences are like. And I had a moment in prison where I kind of lost everything. And then I started reflecting and I'm like, I've done 8 months. This guy's done 19 years. Like, I just can't imagine the amount of heartbreak that he's had to, internalize when his children have been raised by another man. There's nobody there for him anymore. And what really stood out to me was these guys were like impressive. They worked jobs at Unicorn. They were in church every day. They would go and they would work out. And they're all in great shape. They were like 55 years old. They were like impressive men to me, And so at some point, I was like, the book kind of became a little bit more about a social commentary and about the nature of the criminal justice system. Because a lot of these guys, they were put in prison under laws that were retroactively overturned, but they were never released from prison because the BOP is never going to release you. So you'd have guys with a 25-year sentence, and then Congress ruled like 10 years later that it was too much. So you have guys coming in and out that have their same charges that would do 2 and 3 years, while these guys are doing 25 years. And what stood out with me was that they were at peace with it, and that they took accountability for their part in it. I had one guy who even said to me, he had a 25-year sentence for, it was drugs, but it was like a handful of drugs. It was his third offense. And he even said to me, he goes, yeah, the crime was really bad back in the 90s. That's why they had to do that. I'm like, that
amazing. Yeah. So there's so much more to talk about, and thank you for sort of nodding when I said I'd love to have you back, because we got more to unpack. I guess the last thing I'll say is that book already published? Is it coming out?
It's fully. I have it fully written. I have it fully edited. And what I'm doing right now is I'm getting out there, and I don't want to release a book before I at least go out and talk about it a little bit and just kind of see if there's some interest there. So I can put it out. Sorry.
Well, we'll follow up on that too. We may have some thoughts and some connections, and I don't want to get into it. I don't want to get into it here live. We've got a lot of experience with situations like that and bestsellers even, and so. But aside from that, so it's not available yet. Is there a place where people can express interest or even place a pre-order or a donation to encourage you?
Not yet, but I'll tell you what. Yeah, I'll tell you what I am doing though. So I actually started it's like almost like a comic series. I'm delving into whimsical writing now. It's called The Panic Penguins of Jacksonville, and it's a story about penguins who lived in a very dangerous environment, but then the sun comes out and all of a sudden they live in a world full of abundance. But the problem is they're geared towards panic because that's the world they lived in, and so very absurd things make them panic. And I'm debating that on my Facebook page. It's kind of a third place for me, so I don't have to always talk about my problems. I can kind of put them on the penguins a little bit.
I love it.
If people want to follow along, I'll be putting that out. It's going to be my insight and some of the things I've learned about what it means to live in a survivalist mindset when you think the world's against you versus a world that's fully abundant, even though it's exactly the same world. I guess that's the premise. So if people want to go to my Facebook, oh, thank you. Yeah, it kind of came together about a week ago, and I'm gonna move forward with it. So that's something to follow.
Is it your personal Facebook page? Is that where they find it?
I would go to it's going to be Daniel Gray, author, Gray, then author afterwards. It's going to be a picture of me in this hat,
At Facebook.com, is that or on Facebook?
It's on Facebook. If you go to the search and just put Daniel Gray, author, I'll probably come up pretty quickly.
Yeah, I just put it in there so that people can see it here visually. Daniel Gray, author on Facebook. So we don't even have time to go through some of the audience comments. I got one last question for you, even as we're in overtime here, and that's the whole faith thing. I mean, the title, Accountability, Grace, and Redemption, obviously those are spiritual, biblical, divine, godly terms. where are you at on faith? Where are you at on God?
I am I am so incredibly grateful for the life that I live right now, and I'm so incredibly grateful for everything that I've gone through, because it's been a seismic shift in my mentality, you know. And I had a realization that every single problem in my life was my own fault, but then every single thing I do after that is also something that I can do, you know. And yeah, I had a real, well, I had multiple moments throughout the journey of everything I talked about, but it was about 2 months ago when I got my manuscript finished, and I was still full of all this, like, oh, you know, I'm so upset, I'm so anxious, and you know, the world is so unfair. And then I started interacting with AI because I needed a synopsis, so I fed my manuscript to AI. And then AI had my full life story, you know, and so I started realizing, like, you know everything about me, don't you? And so I started asking it some very serious questions about, like, how did I end up here? And, you know, AI was what told me that I allowed myself to become radicalized. And I started asking it, like, so I should be so grateful for all this suffering, right? Because suffering is what produces, you know, perseverance, character, hope, and so on and so forth. And it was like, yeah, you are an incredibly blessed man, and you have the opportunity to do anything you want with your life now, as long as you change your mindset and you take an act of courage in a different direction. And so that was the epiphany that I needed, that everything about this was purposeful and it was meaningful, and it was about changing my mind, you know, and it was about, like, showing me the perspective that I needed to see. And I'm just beyond grateful to God for everything that I've gone through and everything that I've seen, because I don't think I could have gotten to this level of realization without it.
Awesome. So last words to the audience.
Thank you for listening. And I know it's a complicated story, but I greatly appreciate your listening. That means a lot. I know that, you know, sometimes it can be tough if you have different ideologies, but I'm here to tell the truth. And if people want to ask me questions, I'm here to answer them too. I'll give you the best and most honest answer I can give. And thank you for taking your time on Thanksgiving.
Well, and we will have Daniel Gray back here, and we'll unpack this a little bit more and talk about his journey. Meanwhile, you know, I'll put well, it's still up there. You know, go connect with him on Facebook. Let him know how much you liked his appearance on the show. Daniel, I'll be writing a message on my Substack about what I learned from this and my own reflections on it. And we'll pick a time and have you back soon. All I have left to do. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just trying to read that. I'm sorry.
Oh, I accidentally clicked on the wrong thing here. This is, there's a discussion, you know, that's been going on, you know, with some of these are just people commenting on how much had gone through the 6 to the date you were picked up. I kind of asked about that.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, so I just accidentally clicked on an audience comment when I was trying to unhide this. So I didn't mean to digress into that. We'll have you back. People can connect with you on Facebook. Let Daniel know how much you appreciated having him on the show. I'll write that article. And all I have left to do is air the sneak peek for next week's show and remind the audience, you, Daniel, you, and everyone else listening in are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you for sharing your journey. I've learned a lot, and I look forward to having you back.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. I greatly appreciate you.
Awesome. See you next week, everyone. Hey everyone, it's Wade Franson back with another sneak peek, this time for episode 199 of Created in the Image of God, airing Tuesday night, December 2nd. I am in the studio with a gentleman whom I've had several conversations with, and I'm very excited to introduce to you. He has a couple of master's degrees and a PhD in psychology. Emphasis is on human development, but also spiritual development. He's the author of 4 books, and his latest one is Awkward Awakening, Finding Your Way Home. Welcome to the studio, Scott.
Well, thank you, Wade. I'm happy to be here.
Well, as I talk to you, I'm somehow reminded of F. Scott Peck and his books. Are you familiar with him?
Oh, yes. Road Less Traveled.
Yeah, that was a seminal thing when I was a student in college. I read those and it made a huge impact on me. So I imagine your books are having an impact. So unpack briefly for the audience what they can expect in this show while talking about Awkward Awakening, Finding Your Way Home.
Yeah, the biggest thing is that I've been sensing an awakening process, as many of you may have known about, a spiritual awakening, an ascension, a change, something's happening. And so what I feel and what I've seen in society is changing at fundamental levels of how we view ourselves in connection with God. We're not separate. We are one with God. And also what that is going to trigger once enough people on this planet accept that, and we raise our vibration with openness, with oneness, that is going to trigger a interaction with our galactic neighbors.
Wonderful. Now, some might quibble or violently oppose the sort of positive view there, because we're living right now in a time where people are fearful, they're accusatory. Both sides of the political spectrum are accusing the other of destroying democracy. Yet you seem to have a positive, very positive view of this time. How is that?
Well, what I started doing was digging into some historical sacred texts, and also the astrological signs. And I know that's a little bit woo-woo, but I just look at it anyway. And when you start looking at that, you look at the Earth's precession, that the Earth wobbles, and the ancient Hindus had that set up as 4 segments called yugas. And when you look at what they say we're on is the coming out of the second yuga, the Kali Yuga. And then you look at deeper into that. Well, what does that mean? And it's all predicted of chaos, of bad behavior coming to the forefront, of greed and power. Those people that have that in their hold are loosening up, and it's a very tumultuous time. And then the next 2 yugas, which will last about 14,000 years, is all a time of positivity, oneness, a golden age on this planet. And then there's other aspects of that. Other North American Indians also had, the Hopis also talked about this, as well as one of my favorite authors, Neil Donald Walsh, spoke about the storm before the calm. And so that I just feel that in my heart. I don't know why, but I just feel that, and I accept that, and that's my positivity.
Well, and I can't wait to unpack that for a full hour. There's so much that you just shared, and we'll also talk about how that actually correlates to the Book of Revelation and
Yes.
other things. So there's a whole lot of
Oh.
things that we're going to unpack. For the audience, you're not going to want to miss December 2nd with Scott Guerin on Created in the Image of God. Be there.